Good morning. This is a very strange concept for me, looking up this way. I'm reminded of a time many years ago when I lived in Cleveland. A minister of a Unitarian church asked whether I would give a sermon at their church. I'd never given a sermon, haven't since, but I said I would give it if it was okay with him if I just free associated, which in those days was a very unusual thing to do publicly. Still is. What I had not bargained for was that when it was time for me to give my sermon, I had to walk up into some kind of circular stairs up into something projected in the air, and I was standing above everybody, isolated in this little box. And it totally, what do you do when all the electricity lines are jammed? Or it blocked my mind completely. But fortunately, on the lectern, there was the name of a person and the date and the birth of his death. So I simply read his name, the date and the birth of his death, and suddenly was evolved in free associating about infinity. So that helped me to get adapted to being in that kind of a situation. Am I speaking about the right speed for translation? Okay. I've also been told by another translator in Spain to be very sure, to understand very well that humor cannot be translated. So I started this talk out by telling them that humor could not be translated, to be prepared for a boring evening, and they laughed very heartily. But it's all in the telling, I think. But in any case, what I would like to do today is to talk about turning the kaleidoscope of theory around just a little bit in a way that gives us more leverage into the insights into what we're doing. And then turning it around that I'm referring to is based primarily on the idea that we, in Gestalt therapy and in many other schools of psychotherapy, think of ourselves as holistic. We think that the world is very interrelated and that everything is of one piece. And if we're Buddhist, we imagine that the whole world is harmonized, that whatever happens any place affects what happens any place else. And even inanimate objects would affect animates. And there's a lot of merit in that position, but as with most positions in life, nature doesn't hold still for single orientations. Nature is more likely to provide us with paradoxes. And whenever we think we know something, it's going to throw a monkey wrench into the works and bollocks it up one way or another. I hope you can translate bollocks. So the bollocksing up of the works with holism is that the world is not only whole and interrelated, but it is also very individualized. And we cannot go either way with either the concept of individuation or the concept of holism without neglecting one big aspect of what we have to contend with in life, which is namely that we have to reverberate between one form and another. And my sense of that is that if we use the word connectedness, that we're taking account of both the holistic aspects of life, that everything is really interrelated, and the paradoxical quality of life is individuated. So I can talk to you as you, and all I know is you. You are the whole world to me. But somewhere in the background, you are all watching. I wasn't aware for a moment that you were watching, but you are. Nevertheless, I am capable of riding past your presence or the presence of the entire context of the universe or any aspect of it. I'm capable of doing that and focusing on you. And that kind of rhythm between individuation and wholeness is something we contend with whether we want to pay attention to it or not, because they both exist. So connectedness has the advantage of implying both, because when you talk about connectedness as being basic to life, you're talking about the process of bringing individuation together, so that when they're brought together, they are as one. And whether which comes first, whether one comes first or the other, is probably not as important as that they come together. Oh, the transparencies. I've got some transparencies that will give you an idea of what I intended to talk about before I came here. So you'll know that I was sincere in thinking about what I would talk with you about, but I don't talk very well looking at outlines. So I may not do exactly what is set up there. And I also, and I must warn you about this, I may not finish either, because we have a specific length of time available, and I would rather talk to you in my way of talking and not finish than to stick closely to the screened image and finish. I hope you'll agree with me. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. In any case, what I have set up is the idea that connectedness not only has the advantage of taking both individuation and holism into account, but it also has the advantage that we can operationalize it. In other words, we can specify what kinds of connectedness we're talking about, and the kinds of connectedness that I will be talking about. Some will be familiar to you, and some may not be, but we all know that theory is sometimes taken too seriously if we don't juggle it and struggle with it, so that it gets some new impression, some new implications, some new perspective, while still being devoted to the basic quality of the theory. So, in other words, there are going to be 4 different dimensions of connectedness that I want to describe to you today. One of them is the connectedness between moments. Moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. And normally we don't think about connectedness in that way, but as I will explicate in a moment, it is a crucial aspect in the way we live our lives, the way we handle our sequentiality. The second one will be the connectedness from event to event. And that kind of connectedness is represented in the idea of storyline. Like, what are stories? They are simply ways of connecting events. Whenever you tell a story, you connect events together. And the third way is going to be person to person, which is represented in Gestalt therapy by the concept of contact, which I'll say a little more later. And then the fourth is the connection between one part of ourselves and another part of ourselves. And that was represented in the concept of self, which I will describe in terms of what I've referred to as a population of selves, the selves within that must interconnect in order to feel whole. I think we can go on to the next page. Now, Freud, a long time ago, got the idea that mental disturbance, he didn't think of it in these terms then, but he got the idea that things which happened in childhood had become disconnected from things which were happening in adulthood. That there was a gap, a large gap between them, and that his idea was that if we could narrow that gap, or restore the connectedness between the old event and the new event, that he would then achieve a cure, which would mean the person becoming whole, basically, although these were not the terms used in those days. So he established hypnosis as a device for recovering those old events and bringing them into the present. Well, it didn't work, and he gave it up early in the game. He gave it up, he thought, because under hypnosis resistance was lowered, if not eliminated, and that you couldn't have cure if you didn't have resistance. This was his concept. My thought about that is what really happened was that under the hypnosis there was such a disconnect from everyday life achieved through the hypnosis that whatever happened in the hypnotic state, when brought back into the current everydayness, would still not be connected. And that fundamentally what he didn't realize he was doing was trying to establish connectedness, and the hypnosis didn't do it. But then he went on to free association and the concept of transference and interpretation, and that brought it much more closely into everyday life than the hypnosis did, although it had serious disadvantages in terms of always referring to the past, treating transference not as though it was a current experience, but one which related to the past, and so on. So he still had some weakness in the connective tissue of what he was dealing with. Then later on, Pearls came along, and he became very absorbed with the question of presence, and he established what he called the awareness continuum. And this awareness continuum, by this he meant that if you stayed in tune with your awarenesses step by step, that you were inevitably going to reach where you wanted to go. Because organically speaking, if you're tuned in each moment to everything within you, you would, of course, go from where you needed to go. Well, there are a lot of interruptions in that process, of course, and it wasn't as easy as all that. But he stuck pretty closely to awareness on that dimension. But he didn't think in terms of he thought in terms of the present rather than what I now think of as the core of therapy is not the here and now. The core of therapy is the relationship between now and next. Because what we're doing is trying to get movement restored so that people can move forward with their lives, be nourished by that development, and have some sense of completion because they're moving in the direction that's necessary. Now, this concept of the awareness continuum was not all that far removed from the concept of destiny, particularly as Heidegger promulgated it. And without going into the ins and outs of Heidegger's position, he had the incredible insight that we are all organic, meaning that we are put together and that the past, present, and future are unified. That what happens in the past foretells what will happen in the future. When you bring in the concept of destiny, you're already very tempted to already foretell where it's going to go. So you decide, like when we talk about karma, for example, which is another destiny type concept. When we talk of karma, people usually mean there is something in the universe which tells me this is what I'm supposed to do. And then I do it, my karma. That's not a correct interpretation of what's meant by karma. What is meant is that built into what you're doing is a natural directedness. And that if you stay tuned into this native quality within continuingly, you will indeed go to where all of the inputs into that stream are leading you to go. But that is not foretold in advance. So the concept which I have proposed subsequently, which is not all that far removed from Pearls's awareness continuum, but which has some important differences, is the concept of sequentiality, and particularly tight therapeutic sequences. And what I mean by tight therapeutic sequences is that, well, first of all, the difference between that concept and the Pearlsian awareness continuum is that I'm not limiting to awareness, because I think the action part of it is very important. And secondly, I've forgotten what the second one was because I thought of it first, but I said the second first, and now you see I'm in trouble. But we don't, it doesn't really matter very much. But the fact is that what we're trying to deal with is how do you get a person to trust their process through life, doing it by small increments, so that every moment will tell what's going to happen in the next moment. And then through the course of this movement, we will move to where we need to go. Where are we at? Okay, the arrow phenomenon. The arrow phenomenon says this. In every expression throws out a number of arrows into the next moment. It tells you where to go. The only thing is it throws in too many arrows for you really to know, so you still have to make a choice. There's nothing of being swept into it by the pull of each moment. So the problem is, how do you follow these arrows, and how do you move people, therefore, into the nextnesses which are required by their movement through life? And I want to give you an example of that. Okay, so you can read something of what happens when the trip is not a smooth one. But I want to give you a small sample. I can't do the whole thing, but I'll give you a small sample of a session to show you what I mean by moving into the directionality and tightening up the sequences. So I'm going to read you, I don't know whether it's on the, yeah, that's the start of a session I had with somebody in front of a large audience. It wasn't a regular patient. And you can see what she says. She says, what I'm dealing with is my developing as a professional and feeling guilty, depressed, sometimes angry a lot. It deals more with how our profession focuses on individuals. The more I look at individuals, I start to think about what's happening around us and what's happening in the world, and about how I am benefiting from the exploitation of people around the world. That contributes to my feeling guilty, and then I start feeling frustrated and confused. Okay, now any one of you could pick out something from that statement that would feel like it was the arrow pointing to what's next. And I'm sure that if we went around the room and each of you picked yours out, each would be different. There would be some commonalities, but there would be a lot of differences. So let me tell you what I chose in this instance, and I'll tell you why I chose it. But that's not to say that I think that is the way, because I think there's perfectly good other ways to go than the one I went. So I said to her, we do next, yeah. So here's what I said to her. Yes, you've got a big job there. She really had a big job. I understand the importance of attending to all those things, and yet I'm speaking to you now like a lecturer, not like I was speaking to her at the time. You have to understand the difference. In order to speak to you, I have to raise my voice a little bit, and I don't have the relationship, but I did then. I understand the importance of attending to all those things, and yet there's so much in the world you're having trouble coordinating. So maybe you need a little more practice, as a circus acrobat might, doing big flips. Maybe we can do a few of those flips here on the ground. Okay. Now, so what I'm basically responding to there is her sincerity for one thing. She's really sincere in wanting to help people all over the world. Her grandiosity, which implies that if she doesn't solve it all, that everything is not worth doing. And to try to give her some down-to-earth help so that she wouldn't be so high in the stratosphere, and find some way of making her needs actualized so that she could wind up with some success in this enterprise that she is proposing. And the rest of the session, and I won't go into the rest of the session because I realize I'm totally beyond time. The rest of the session, following the same principles of tightening sequences, led to her recognition of her tendency to make speeches, which she reveals as we went along in the session. Instead of talking to people and expecting responses, she is always making speeches and never getting responses. And instead of being ambitious, we try to help her to be accomplished. So for her, ambition is really more important at this point than accomplishment. And instead of having her mind made up, to let her ideas evolve. So those were the things that I engaged in the rest of the session. And at one time I had her engaged in dialogue with the imagined audience. And in fact, in one point she said something that was really quite moving to the audience. And the audience applauded, and she went on as though nothing had happened. So I said, did you hear anything just then when you were talking? She heard the applause. Well, what was it like? Confirming, but sort of passing over and quickly going on to what she wanted to say. So how do you succeed when every chance you have a success you ignore because you've already made up your mind about what you want to say? Anyway, in the final analysis, to make the long story short, she wound up passing a petition around in the audience, petitioning this particular conference to have more women and more blacks at the next conference, and other kinds of equality making things. She passed the petition around and got quite a bit of response for it. So the idea is, if you can establish, and this may be, you may feel this to be a bit of a stretch, but I think it has a lot of merit, that if you can be with a person step by step, and you're tuned in close enough that they'll take that next step, very soon they will have a feeling of course, of course, of course, of course, yes, 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 yes. And they will move along with what you're doing in a way that they would not otherwise if they were interrupted every step of the way and never had the feeling of this of courseness. And I think most of us therapists do intuitively do that, but intuition backed up by the concept, I think, makes a difference. So in a sense, what you have is a quasi-hypnotic state. A quasi-hypnotic quality being that if one thing follows the other carefully, regularly, you will give up your usual barriers to continuity. So I could do it in a moment. I could say, I'm going to do something right now that, listen to me. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. It's as simple as that, and yet life is so much more complicated that we never really know which thing to tune into that will give us that quality. Okay, enough now about tight therapeutic sequences. I want to talk about the other dimensions of connectedness. Well, if I tell you that I woke up this morning, I went for a walk, I got lost for a moment, I found my way back, and I went in and had breakfast, that's a story. Not one that you'd go out of your way to hear, but still, stories aren't all intriguing and challenging and exciting, but they're stories. The story aspect of it is that it ties together a whole number of things. It ties together me, walk, lost, breakfast, and a couple of other things I said. They get tied together by the story. And that happens not only in that small dimension of existence, but it applies to a lifetime. And of course, a lifetime will have, you could say one story about your lifetime, or you could have 1,000 stories about your lifetime. But if you respect the storyline of your life, then you will respect your life, because they're synchronous. So it's a little like finding your way through your lifetime, like locating yourself. If you can imagine our lives are 10 more minutes. We're in big trouble. Sorry. If you can imagine Hansel and Gretel dropping their breadcrumbs along the way so that they could find their way back. But the birds ate them. They couldn't find their way back, and you know the trouble they got into. The same way with our lifetime. If we can't find our way back, if we can't find the sense of the pathway of our lives, it diminishes the registration of our lives. That basically what we need, in addition to the general process of living, which means doing, talking, remembering, all the things we do, we have to find some way that this registers so that we know we've lived a life. And the storyline will make a big contribution in terms of registering that existence. Now, it's not that easy to do, because stories, first of all, are hard to tell when there are problems connected with them. And second of all, we very often tell the wrong stories in the wrong ways. So part of our job in therapy is to get at the right story. So we have people coming in telling stories. Sometimes they don't tell stories very much. We try to help them into telling stories in many ways, but very often it's not the right story. So I'm thinking of a particular person who had a friend who committed suicide. It was a couple. The man of the couple committed suicide. The woman, a dear friend, was in deep, deep depression, and my patient, her friend, could not help her out of it. Obviously, she was working against the grain, because it's something that would be very hard to get out of. You have to be in it first. But that's another matter, what would be good for my patient's friend. My patient was living a life in which she was being obsessed with this issue, and the rest of the things that were happening in her life were being set aside in the service of this obsession. Even though she was living her life, was having a good relationship, perhaps for the first time in her life, with a man. And so I tried to direct her into some other part of her life. Well, I know about this that's going on, and I want to know what else is going on in your life. Well, one of the things that was going on that she wasn't telling me was she just got engaged to this man, engaged to be married. And she was overjoyed. And once she got to talking about this, her whole manner changed. And what this would do, what this kind of versatility would do, would be to acquaint her with the fact that though she cares deeply about this friend, there are many things which she can encompass as a part of her life. And to be able to get that versatility reestablished is what we're largely trying to do in therapy, because versatility is a key thing to transcending any particular problem. Is it possible to have a problem while still living a life that's rich? The answer is yes, and the challenge in therapy is to find the yes for that. Now, included within this problem is what I've referred to as the pain-drama ratio. There is a quality of pain is a great sharpener of perspective. It's very narrow. When you're in pain, there's nothing in the world but the pain. And rightfully so. That's what pain calls for. At the same time, you have a large life. And drama is a process by which you restore that pain or anything else into the context of your life, so that nothing becomes isolated by itself apart from your actual life. Now, that's easier said than done, and we all know when we've been in pain, nothing I can say here is going to change the fact that this is a very great challenge, and that temporarily at least, we are incapable of managing that restoration of the drama of our lives. But once the pain has found a place within the drama of one's life, then you have a more total global experience of life in which the pain is included. So then we may become scarred but not debilitated. We may become in pain but still functioning well. We may lose a friend and have other friends. Life gives us that option of flexibility and versatility, which pain fights, because pain is a healing process partly through accentuating that which is painful. Like I have a friend whose house burned down. Everything. They had 2 cars, he and she, and they were in such a rush to get out of that area where the fire was coming, they couldn't even wait to take the second car. So everything was lost. And yet now, that's simply a part of the story of their lives. Nothing which they lost there is preventing them from living well now. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the past storyline into the connectedness between person and person. I think it's pretty obvious that the concept of contact is a statement of the intimate relationship of one person to another, so much so that the contact boundary itself, which is what contact is based on, is said to be a union of self and other, so much so that one wouldn't recognize which was which. Now, in the process of living, we learn to differentiate, but ultimately we have to be restored to this experience of good quality contact. Now, good quality contact is important between therapist and patient, and the idea there is not to dissuade the person by your own abstractions or distancing or such from being engaged, always being aware of the risks of engagement, because we're not in a position where we should be inveigling people into joining us, but being open to that union. And that union, we could go for a long time into the details of the contact factors that one must take account of, but it also stretches beyond the face-to-face therapeutic contact into the concept of community, of belonging. We could even stretch it into the concept of religion, and we can be oriented toward the necessary condition in living to be in contact with not only special other people, but in contact with our environment, our community, our purposes, our philosophy, to make them all of a whole. Now, part of what happens in creating this contact factor is something that a number of theorists have recognized, and that's the magnification factor in therapy. Freud recognized it with his concept of transference, which made every experience seem so important because it represented all, so that there was a tremendous amount of contact, a tremendous amount of union between the therapist and the patient, even in psychoanalysis where the idea was to be neutral. Any leftover things on these issues we can deal with in the question time, because I have run out of time. I'm right, am I not, about the time? Yeah. Yes. Now, the fourth dimension is a dimension of self. And what I'm proposing is that within each of us there is a native clustering process. I'm going to skip over Fritz's top dog, underdog. But basically there's this clustering process, which you could call a configurational reflex, which takes a number of experiences that anyone would have, brings them together, and we can name them. Let me read an example of that. I think it's worth reading this so that you get the point of what I'm saying. Is that also? I think it's on the next. No, suppose he and the therapist. Well, I'm going to read it to you. The clustering process. The therapist must be careful to name these clusters properly. For example, a person plays golf with his son. He sings a birthday greeting to his daughter. He advises a young colleague. He offers moral philosophy to his students. He holds his wife in his arms when she's shivering. He listens carefully when people speak. He argues strenuously with people who are, he thinks, ignoring their best interests, etc. Now that's a recognizable cluster of experiences, and we would all probably name it differently. But suppose we named this cluster of experiences his caring self. I think that would be a fair naming for that cluster of experiences. Then that naming of his caring self takes account of many of his experiences, but gives it a clarity, and it recognizes the natural clustering that happens within people by our own configurational reflex. So it's from this clustering that he can feel his identity, but we then have to deal with contradictions. Suppose sometimes he gets angry with somebody. Suppose sometimes he insists that something is done his way. So we call that a dominating self. Is that a different person? Of course not. All the people who are caring people may also be dominating people. But what is he going to do with his concept of these different selves? How is he going to integrate them? How will he connect them? And the task of the therapy is to do that connecting link. And there are a number of ways of doing it. Through dialogue, through orientation, through playing out a particular aspect, and so on. So then we have the question of why the self. Why do we care about people having a self? Because the self concept is a summation of one's existence. And we all have summation requirements, because we live with a kaleidoscopic quality, and if not for the summations that exist in our lives, we would be confused, go off in many directions, not be guided in the path that fits us best. So we have two things that we're dealing with. One is the improvement of function through the dealing with the things which are clustered and named as selves, on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the question of identity. And both factors are important. And usually psychotherapy has tended to neglect identity in the service of improving function. But I think we need to be restored to both. So in conclusion then, we have the concept of connectedness, which has many dimensions to it, and which, if we can pay attention to how it works in the lives of our patients or in the lives of our community, will guide us in the particular forms of connectedness that we can benefit from. Thank you. And I've just recently come out of retirement. So professionally, I'm in the midst of writing what I hope will turn into a book, and I spent considerable time on that. What I'm writing about is the concept of what would psychotherapy look like if we had not opposed religion. In other words, what kinds of things would be added into our repertoire if we had seen ourselves not as a corrective against religion, but as a renewal or a revision of religion. And Jung in the beginning did see it as a religious experience. Freud did not. And we went in the direction of the curative direction and neglected the community aspects of what therapy needs, so that people are almost always getting therapy outside of their community circumstances. So the problem of how to restore what we left out is something which I've been working on. Any other questions? Yes. Sorry, I can't hear you. Did you hear?
When does connectedness start in the childhood? Is this the
What?
question?
What does what start?
Connectedness?
Oh, connectedness, I think is a natural process. So it doesn't require deliberation. It doesn't require thinking, although as we mature, the world gets complex in a way that requires us to think and to strategize and to recognize when we're missing something, to make choices that fit together. So we make one choice that doesn't fit our lives, it will hurt us. Another choice where it connects readily will benefit us. So, but it starts in the beginning, I think, just chemically, biochemically. The same thing I'm saying about people holds true for neurons. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Just take this.
Finally brought something to put your books on, but it's pretty high.
Thanks.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Na. Genau. Ja, auf jeden Fall, weil du weißt nicht, vielleicht hat es nicht gescheit aufgenommen oder so. Okay. Dann müssen wir das aber, warte mal,